Millionaire discovers the shocking truth about a homeless girl. The ending will leave you in tears. Helen Grant was the epitome of success. A millionaire and owner of a fashion empire in Chicago, her life was marked by luxury and wealth. She lived in an extravagant penthouse in the city center, surrounded by art, fine furniture, and the constant care of staff who attended to her every need. Helen had earned everything on her own. Coming from a humble background, she had learned that life offered nothing for free, and for that reason she had hardened. She firmly believed that everyone should fend for themselves without relying on anyone's help. Her empire had been built with sweat and sacrifice, but over the years, her success only fed her coldness. Helen no longer believed in charity or selfless help. If she had managed to escape extreme poverty and achieve wealth, anyone else could do the same, she thought. This hardened philosophy distanced her from the human issues that once moved her. Her humble past was buried under layers of success. That night, Helen was returning from a gala event, exhausted. Her driver, Mark, drove silently through Chicago's busy streets. Helen barely noticed the city lights. Her thoughts were far away, focused on negotiations, contracts, and the future expansion of her empire. What she didn't expect was that, on that very night, her life was about to take a new direction. As they stopped at a traffic light, a small figure approached the car. Lucy, a 10-year-old homeless girl, was offering flowers to passers-by. With a dirty face, worn clothes, and bright eyes, she extended her hand toward Helen through the open car window. "Ma'am, would you like to buy a flower?" "Just $1, Lucy said in a soft but emotional voice. Helen, in a hurry and out of patience, gave the girl a cold glance. For a moment, she remembered herself as a child, selling candies on the corners to survive. But the thought was quickly suppressed. Helen believed the world was cruel, and if she had managed to make it, others should too. It wasn't her responsibility to solve other people's problems. "I don't have time for this," Helen replied curtly, turning her head. Lucy, however, didn't give up. Her bright eyes still filled with hope. She insisted, "Please, I need money to buy food for me and my grandmother." The mention of a grandmother made Helen hesitate for a brief second. But she quickly recovered and, in a hard tone, replied, "That's not my problem. We all have our struggles. You should find a way to solve yours without relying on others." With that, she closed the window, ending the conversation. The car sped off as the light turned green, leaving Lucy behind, holding the flowers no one wanted to buy. Helen didn't look back. In the front seat, Mark, Helen's longtime driver, observed the scene silently. He knew Helen well enough to understand that behind all that wealth and coldness was a woman who had once been touched by the hardships of life. But unlike her, Mark didn't believe success justified coldness. Without Helen noticing, he took out a $20 bill and discreetly announced that the car would stop a few meters ahead. "I'll just check something in the car," he said. Helen, deep in her thoughts, barely paid attention. Mark got out and quickly returned to where Lucy stood, buying all the flowers the girl had. He wasn't a rich man, far from it. His salary was modest, but he believed small gestures could change lives. As he handed the money to Lucy, he said, "This is for you and your grandmother. Don't give up, okay?" Lucy smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude but no words. Mark returned to the car, satisfied knowing he had helped someone, at least for that night. On the way home, Helen felt an odd emptiness creeping into her chest. Something about that brief interaction with Lucy deeply disturbed her. The girl's face, her hopeful eyes, and the memory of when Helen had been in that position herself. But she quickly pushed those thoughts aside. It wasn't time to reflect on the past. Life was now. When she arrived at her luxurious residence, surrounded by everything money could buy, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Even though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what, she knew that her brief encounter with Lucy wouldn't be easily forgotten. The next morning arrived with the sunlight streaming through the massive windows of Helen's penthouse. Life followed its usual rhythm, and as always, she dove into her routine of meetings, contracts, and decisions that dictated the course of her fashion empire. The luxury surrounding her was a symbol of everything she had achieved through her hard work, and Helen had always believed that this success was solely the result of her willpower. But as the day went on, that nagging sense of emptiness began to disturb her again. In the midst of her perfect routine, something felt out of place. The image of the homeless girl, Lucy, kept appearing in her mind more frequently than she cared to admit. Helen tried to push these thoughts away, but they persisted, reminding her of her own past. There was something in Lucy's persistence, in the way she held those flowers with hope, that made Helen feel uncomfortable. During lunch, Helen was discussing a new clothing line with some businessmen. Everything seemed to be going well until, suddenly, she found herself distracted, gazing out of the window, lost in her thoughts. Lucy's face came to mind once again. A sense of unease settled in. "Helen, is everything all right?" one of the businessmen asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes, of course. Just thinking about some details of the next project," Helen quickly replied, trying to mask her wandering thoughts. But inside, an unrest consumed her. It was as if a part of her past was coming back to haunt her. Years ago, Helen had also been a homeless child, selling candies to survive. At that time, her only companion was her mother, a woman who worked tirelessly to give her a decent life. When her mother fell ill, Helen had to fight on her own. And it was during that difficult phase that a stranger approached and offered her an opportunity. Helen pushed the memories aside, reminding herself that it was that woman who made her believe in the power of fighting for her dreams. She had accepted the help, but decided that she would never depend on anyone again. And now Lucy, with her persistence and need, was stirring up old emotions that Helen preferred to forget. By the end of the day, when she got into the car to return home, Helen was still lost in her thoughts. The driver, Mark, noticed her through the rearview mirror but said nothing. Helen's coldness was just a facade, something built over the years. After all, he knew her past better than anyone because of the stories she rarely shared. "Is something wrong today?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. "No, just another long day," Helen responded evasively, not in the mood to talk. The car drove through the busy streets of the city, and as they passed the same corner as the night before, Helen once again caught sight of Lucy, still holding her flowers. The girl seemed tired, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of life was already crushing her youth. Helen glanced quickly, but turned her eyes away just as fast. "Mark, speed up. I don't want to waste time," Helen said, her tone harsher than she had intended. Mark, however, hesitated. He had bought Lucy's flowers the previous night and recognized the look of someone who had nothing. An internal struggle brewed within him, for he knew that, even if Helen wouldn't admit it, that little girl was affecting her, and maybe he could help soften her hardened heart. "You know, Helen," Mark began, carefully choosing his words, "sometimes a small kindness can change someone's life. It could be something simple, but for those struggling on the streets, it can mean the world." Helen didn't respond immediately. Mark's words lingered in her mind, but she refused to admit that anything was bothering her. She turned toward the window, trying to ignore the discomfort growing inside her. "I'm not responsible for other people's problems, Mark. Everyone has their own battles. That's just the reality of life." Mark simply nodded, not pressing the issue. Helen had built an armor around herself, something that protected her from any vulnerability. However, he believed that behind this facade was a woman who had once known the pain of poverty and rejection. And it was only a matter of time before that truth resurfaced. When they arrived at Helen's building, she quickly got out of the car as if she were running from something. Mark watched as she entered the lobby, silent but clearly troubled. As he saw her walk away, he wondered how much longer she could ignore the memories of her own past. Helen was facing an internal battle, and Mark knew that, sooner or later, she would have to deal with it. Inside her luxurious apartment, Helen threw herself onto the sofa, closing her eyes and trying to relax. But the image of Lucy persisted in her mind. The weight of the rejection she herself had suffered in her childhood seemed to return, and for the first time in years, Helen felt a pang of regret. Maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake. In the days that followed, the image of Lucy standing on the corner stubbornly returned to Helen's mind. No matter how busy she was with meetings, contracts, or the decisions that kept her fashion empire running, something within her had shifted. Helen fought to ignore the feeling, but it grew stronger each day. She had worked hard to build her fortune, and much of her success came from her ability to remain cold and detached in the face of adversity. To her, that was what separated winners from losers. However, something was different this time. The emptiness that had crept into her life began to intensify. That morning, as she looked at the luxurious coffee table in her apartment, piled with reports and million-dollar proposals, she realized that the things that once filled her with pride now seemed superficial. The sense of emptiness grew, a feeling that no matter how much wealth she accumulated, something essential was slipping through her fingers. Later that afternoon, Helen decided to leave work early. She didn't explain to anyone why, merely telling her assistant she needed some time alone. She got into the car and asked Mark to drive her home, but something was stopping her from simply relaxing. As they passed the corner where Lucy sold flowers, Helen made a sudden decision. "Stop here, Mark. I want to take a walk," she ordered, looking out the window. Mark was surprised but said nothing. He pulled the car over, and Helen got out with hesitant steps. She walked down the sidewalk, pretending to be disinterested, but her eyes searched for Lucy. She needed to know if the girl was still there. A strange need to know more about her stirred within Helen, something she couldn't quite explain. After walking a few steps, Helen saw Lucy sitting on the curb, her eyes distant, and the flowers by her side. The contrast between the young girl and the luxury of the city around her was stark. Helen hesitated for a moment, but before she could change her mind, Lucy noticed her. The girl quickly stood up and once again approached, holding out a flower. "Ma'am, please, just $1, Lucy said, her voice soft and tired. This time, Helen didn't respond right away. Something in her expression had changed. The usual hardness gave way to a sense of unease she couldn't hide. The memory of her own childhood came flooding back. She felt small again, like the days when she stood on the streets selling candies, begging for the attention of strangers. "Why are you here?" Helen asked, unable to take her eyes off the girl. Lucy looked at her with evident surprise. She was used to being ignored, rejected, or simply invisible to most people. "I'm trying to earn money to buy food," Lucy replied, her voice mixing exhaustion and need. "And your parents? Where are they?" Helen continued, though she didn't want to seem intrusive. Lucy lowered her eyes, clutching the flower in her hands. "My mom died. I live with my grandma. She's sick, so I work to buy food and medicine for her." The silence that followed was thick. Helen couldn't process the information immediately. A humble past, the pain of losing a mother. All of it seemed to stir something deep inside her. She felt confronted by the harsh reality Lucy was living, a reality she herself had once faced. "How old are you?" Helen asked, her voice betraying slight emotion. 10, Lucy responded, still with her eyes downcast. 10 years old. Exactly the age Helen had been when she began fighting for survival on the streets of Chicago. Suddenly, all the defenses she had built over the years began to crumble. There was a connection between them, something Helen couldn't ignore any longer. She remembered the day when a stranger had helped her, changing the course of her life. A woman whose face Helen could barely remember, but whose gesture had been pivotal. Without realizing it, Helen's eyes filled with tears. She quickly turned her face away, trying to hide her emotion, but the emptiness she had felt for so long now seemed to have an explanation. All the luxury, the wealth, the possessions, none of it could substitute for the raw truth of life. And at that moment, Helen understood that no matter how much she had achieved, she had lost something fundamental: her humanity. "You shouldn't be here," Helen said, more to herself than to Lucy. "No child should live like this." Lucy didn't respond, but her steady gaze reflected a truth Helen already knew. The girl was fighting a lonely battle, just as Helen had once done. The difference was that, back then, someone had reached out to her. And now, faced with Lucy, Helen began to question her own choices. "What can I do for you?" Helen asked impulsively, feeling an overwhelming need to do something. Anything. Lucy, still surprised by the change in tone, hesitated for a moment before answering. I just want to buy food and medicine for my grandma. That's all." The simplicity of the request touched something deep within Helen. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about charity. Lucy was asking for dignity, something Helen understood all too well. With a serious expression, Helen extended her hand and, for the first time, felt the weight of her own words. "I'll help you, but not with handouts. I want to do more than that." Lucy stared at Helen, wide-eyed, unsure of what was happening. The millionaire woman who had rejected her just days before was now offering real help. In the days that followed, Helen's decision to help Lucy weighed heavily on her. She wasn't used to getting involved in other people's lives, especially those of street children. The life she had built shielded her from emotions, and acting on something that wasn't purely rational deeply unsettled her. Still, there was something she couldn't ignore. Lucy had ignited a flame that Helen thought had long been extinguished: empathy. That night, Helen decided to return to the corner where she had met Lucy. She wasn't sure what she would do or how she would help, but she felt compelled to take the next step. The car pulled up to the same corner. A light drizzle blanketed the city, and the sharp wind made the few pedestrians quicken their pace. Lucy was there as usual with her flowers. Her messy hair was wet, and the small basket she carried held fewer flowers than usual. When Lucy saw Helen approaching, she froze. Her eyes reflected a mixture of surprise and distrust. Why had this woman, who had once rejected her, come back? "I told you I would return," Helen said, stopping in front of the girl. "We need to talk." Lucy, not knowing what to expect, simply nodded. She held one of the flowers in her small hand and offered it again. "I really don't need the flowers, Lucy. I want to help you in another way." The girl hesitated, unsure of what a distant, wealthy woman could possibly do for her. Helen noticed the confusion in Lucy's eyes and, taking a deep breath, tried to be clear. "Where do you live?" Helen asked suddenly. "In an apartment with my grandma. She's very sick." Lucy responded briefly, as if speaking about her reality was painful. "Can I take you there?" Lucy stared at Helen, suspicious. She wasn't accustomed to kindness or selfless acts. Yet something in the millionaire's eyes conveyed sincerity. Perhaps it was time to trust someone, even if that idea was frightening. The girl nodded in agreement, signaling for Helen to follow. Helen called for Mark, who had been watching everything from afar. Silently, he helped Lucy into the car. The three drove through the bustling streets of Chicago, but as they moved away from the center, the scenery began to change. The bright lights and luxurious buildings gave way to worn-out structures, narrow alleys, and neglected facades. Helen felt a heaviness in her chest as she looked around. It had been a long time since she had been in a place like this. The poverty surrounding her reminded her of a life she preferred to forget. The car stopped in front of an old building, its peeling walls and broken windows a clear sign of neglect. Lucy got out and looked at Helen as if to say, "This is it." Helen felt a mixture of surprise and discomfort. She had never imagined a child like Lucy could live in such dire conditions. She followed the girl to the apartment. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint groan came from inside. As they entered, Helen was greeted by the strong smell of mildew and medicine. Lucy's grandmother, a frail-looking woman with pale skin, lay on an old sofa, covered with a tattered blanket. She coughed weakly, her tired eyes slowly opening as she noticed strangers in the room. "Grandma, this is the lady I told you about," Lucy explained in a sweet voice. "She wants to help." The elderly woman tried to sit up but was too weak. Helen, feeling out of place in such a scene, cautiously approached. She hadn't been in a place like this since her childhood. Everything in that room reminded her of a reality she knew all too well but had long avoided. The worn-out furniture, the daily struggle for survival, the fear of not knowing what tomorrow would bring. Each detail brought back old, painful memories for Helen. "Are you the one taking care of Lucy?" Helen asked, her voice unusually gentle. "I am. Ever since my daughter passed, I've been looking after her." The grandmother replied between coughs, her voice frail. Helen remained silent for a moment, feeling awkward and out of place in that small, worn-down apartment. But she knew she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. "I want to help you," Helen finally said, looking from the elderly woman to Lucy. "I can provide medical care, food, whatever you need." Lucy looked at her grandmother, waiting for a response. The old woman sighed and, with effort, replied, "We appreciate it, but we don't want charity. We just need an opportunity for Lucy to study, so she can have a better life than mine." Those words hit Helen hard. The dignity of the grandmother, even in the face of illness and poverty, reminded her so much of her own mother. Helen had also refused charity when she was young but had accepted the opportunity to change her life. And now she saw clearly that this was what Lucy needed. Not handouts, but a real chance to grow. "I understand," Helen said, trying to maintain her composure. "I promise I'll do something for Lucy. It won't be charity. It will be an opportunity." Lucy stared at Helen, not quite knowing what to say. The offer seemed almost too good to be true, but at the same time, a spark of hope began to ignite within her. As Helen left that small, worn-out apartment, she couldn't shake the reality she had witnessed. She was standing before a reflection of her own life. Lucy wasn't just a street child. She was a reflection of what Helen had once been, and that realization unsettled her deeply. In the days that followed, Helen dedicated herself to finding out more about Lucy and her family. It wasn't just a passing impulse. Something deeper was driving her. It was as if, by helping Lucy, she could also redeem herself from something she couldn't clearly define. The coldness with which she had always handled other people's problems now seemed to melt away in the face of the girl's reality. Every memory of her own childhood sparked a new determination within her. One morning, Helen decided to take action. She called Mark and asked him to take her to Lucy's apartment. She wanted to talk to the girl and her grandmother, but more than that, she had made up her mind to offer something truly significant. When she arrived at the rundown building, Helen found Lucy sitting on the steps outside, clutching an old, scribbled notebook. When the girl saw Helen, her eyes widened, but there was a shadow of doubt in them, as if she couldn't believe that this wealthy woman had really come back. "Hi, Lucy," Helen said softly, surprising even herself with her tone. "Hi," Lucy replied hesitantly. "I didn't think you'd come back." "I promised I would," Helen replied, sitting down next to her. "Can I talk to your grandmother?" Lucy nodded and quickly went inside the building to call her grandmother. While she waited, Helen looked around, observing the surroundings. Everything exuded a sense of abandonment, a portrait of a life lived in survival mode. When Lucy returned with her grandmother, Helen felt a tightness in her chest. The elderly woman looked even frilier than the last time, but her eyes, though tired, still held an unshakable dignity. "Please have a seat," Helen gestured to one of the steps. Lucy's grandmother sat down slowly, while Lucy stood by her side, still unsure of what was about to happen. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can help you," Helen began, her voice firm but gentle. "I know you don't want charity, and I respect that, but I have a proposal for Lucy, an opportunity." The grandmother looked at her granddaughter, who was still clutching the notebook tightly, as if it were a shield. "What kind of opportunity?" the grandmother asked, her voice weak but curious. Helen took a deep breath before continuing. "When I was a child, I went through something similar to what you're going through now. We had nothing. I also sold things on the street just like Lucy. And one day, someone extended a hand to me and gave me a chance to change my life. It wasn't charity, it was an opportunity. I want to do the same for Lucy." Lucy's eyes widened even more, while her grandmother listened intently to Helen's words. "What are you proposing?" the elderly woman asked, a mixture of hope and caution in her voice. "I want Lucy to get an education. I'll make sure she has access to a good school, something that will give her a real chance to live a different life. I want her to have the opportunities one had," Helen explained, feeling a growing determination within her. "And I'll make sure you get the medical care you need, too." The silence that followed was heavy, but full of meaning. Lucy looked at her grandmother, waiting for her reaction. The elderly woman let Helen's words hang in the air for a few seconds before responding. "Lucy, what do you think about this?" the grandmother asked, gazing affectionately at the girl. Lucy, unsure of what to say, looked back at Helen. The proposal was something she had never even considered. She never imagined she would have the chance to escape the life she was living. But the dignity her grandmother had taught her still made her hesitate. "I don't want charity," Lucy repeated, as if she needed to reinforce the idea more to herself than to the others. "It's not charity," Helen reassured her with a gentle smile. "I want you to study, grow, and make something of your life, but you'll have to work hard for it. It won't be easy, but it will be fair." Lucy's eyes began to sparkle, not just at the prospect of the proposal, but at the way Helen spoke to her. There was honesty in her voice, a promise of dignity. It wasn't a gift handed down, it was a real opportunity. And that made all the difference. Lucy's grandmother sighed deeply, clearly emotional. The woman who, just days earlier, had seemed so cold and distant was now offering something she had never imagined possible. "It would be a dream," the elderly woman said, discreetly wiping away a tear that had rolled down her cheek. "I've always wanted Lucy to have a better life than mine." Lucy glanced at her grandmother, noticing the emotion in her eyes. This was the chance they had both hoped for, even if they had never said it out loud. "I accept," Lucy said, her voice steady, though still slightly trembling. Helen felt a profound sense of relief upon hearing those words. She knew she was doing the right thing, and at that moment, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just about helping a homeless girl. In helping Lucy, Helen was reconnecting with the part of herself she had long forgotten amid all the wealth and luxury. "I'll arrange everything so you can start school as soon as possible," Helen said, looking at Lucy with confidence. "And you, ma'am, will receive the medical care you need." Lucy's grandmother nodded, too emotional to say anything further. Lucy, on the other hand, felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. For the first time in a long while, she had real hope for a better future. As Helen left that building, something inside her had changed irreversibly. The emptiness she had felt for so long was beginning to lift. By helping Lucy, she was, in a way, rescuing the girl she had once been. And with that, she found a new sense of purpose in her life. Months passed since Helen had taken it upon herself to oversee Lucy's education and her grandmother's health. Gradually, the young girl's life was transforming in ways she had never imagined. Helen, for her part, felt increasingly connected to this new phase of her own life. It wasn't just about giving money or providing resources. It was about personal involvement. Helen had become a mentor to Lucy, guiding her not only through her studies, but also teaching her about the value of responsibility and dignity. With each visit to the small apartment, Helen saw the light in Lucy's eyes grow. The girl, who had once struggled to envision a future, now had plans, dreams, and spoke excitedly about her school subjects and how she wanted to learn more. She even started talking about the possibility of one day following in Helen's footsteps in the business world. The transformation was undeniable, and Helen saw more and more of herself reflected in the young girl who had once stood on the same street corners. One day, while walking together in a park near Lucy's apartment, their conversation took an unexpected turn. "Helen, why are you doing all this for me?" Lucy asked, with curiosity written all over her face. "Don't get me wrong, I'm really grateful, but I've never asked why you're going to such lengths." Helen paused for a moment, staring at the horizon, and sighed. She had never explained her true motivation, but she knew that sooner or later, this conversation was bound to happen. "When I first saw you that night, something long buried inside me came rushing back. Your story, Lucy, reminded me so much of my own. I was once a street child, too, selling things to survive. And there came a moment when someone appeared and gave me a chance to change my life. I never forgot that, but over time, success and wealth pushed me further away from what really mattered." Helen explained, her voice filled with emotion. Lucy listened quietly, hanging on to every word. "When I saw you on that corner, I realized I had been drifting away from who I truly was. Helping you is a way for me to reconnect with that part of my past. And honestly, it gives me a sense of purpose that I didn't even realize I needed." Helen continued, her eyes now locked onto Lucy's. The silence that followed was profound, but not uncomfortable. Lucy understood now that there was a much deeper connection between them than just an act of generosity. They shared a journey, even if it had taken different forms. "I didn't know your life had been like that," Lucy said with a tone of respect. "It makes everything you've done for me mean even more." Helen smiled, and they continued their walk. But that night, when Helen returned home, she began to reflect even more deeply on her past. Something still bothered her. In her recent efforts to learn more about Lucy's background, she had discovered some details that shocked her. A secret that would change everything. Helen returned to Lucy's apartment the next day, determined to uncover the truth. When she arrived, Lucy's grandmother was sitting in the same worn-out chair, but there was something different in her gaze, an almost palpable weight that the elderly woman seemed to carry, and that day, it felt even heavier. "We need to talk," Helen said, her voice serious. Lucy's grandmother nodded slowly, as if she already knew what was coming. "I did some research about your family," Helen began, sitting down on a nearby chair, "and I discovered something that I need to understand better." At that moment, Lucy walked into the room, her face curious as she sat beside her grandmother. "What did you find out?" Lucy asked with a hint of concern. Helen turned to the grandmother, waiting for her to take the initiative. The elderly woman sighed deeply, as if she had been carrying a secret for a long time. "It's time for you to know the truth, Lucy," the grandmother said, her voice trembling. "Helen, what you discovered is true. You and Lucy have a much deeper connection than either of you could have imagined." The silence in the room became thick with tension. Helen felt a chill run down her spine, anticipating the revelation. "Lucy, your mother, Alice, was my daughter," the grandmother began. "And Helen, Alice was your sister." Helen froze. A wave of emotions washed over her as she heard those words. A sister she had lost contact with so long ago, a part of her life that, due to pride and circumstances, had been left behind. "My sister," Helen whispered in disbelief. Alice was your mother, Lucy?" The girl looked at Helen, confused and emotional all at once. "Yes," the grandmother confirmed, her eyes brimming with tears. "Alice disappeared years ago, caught up in troubles you didn't know about. I tried to raise Lucy on my own after she vanished. I didn't want you to know out of fear of what you might think, of what it might bring to light. But now I see that was a mistake. Lucy is your niece, Helen. Helen could barely process the information. It all seemed surreal, but at the same time, it made perfect sense. The connection she had felt with Lucy from the very beginning now had a clear explanation. Fate had found a way to reconnect them, despite the years and the distance. This changes everything, Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. I left my sister behind, and now I see the result of that. But I'm going to do everything I can to take care of you, Lucy. I promise we'll find Alice, wherever she is. Lucy looked at Helen, still stunned by the revelation. But at the same time, an invisible bond was beginning to form between them. They weren't just benefactor and recipient, they were family. Helen left the apartment that day with a renewed sense of purpose. To find her sister and, at the same time, ensure that Lucy had everything her mother couldn't provide. As she walked through the streets of Chicago, she felt a definitive transformation in her heart. The journey that had begun with a simple rejection had now turned into a search for reconciliation and redemption. And for the first time in a long time, Helen felt whole.